there is no such thing as a good or bad Zionism. Rather, all Zionism is poisonous because it's systematically entrenched in the behaviors of the Israeli state's fascist colonial project, its citizens' attitudes, and its actions towards the victims of Zionism. On the flip side, since its origins, political Zionism refused to aid Jewish people who were fighting for liberation from their oppressors. Instead, it sought to segregate them and ally itself with anti-Semitic monsters. Thus, political Zionism cannot be reformed or changed from the inside. Instead, I and many other Palestinian and Jewish comrades argue it must be destroyed. Now, I'm well aware that the anti-Zionist position is frightful. It's threatening, even. However, to those who are pro-Zionism, pro-Israel, and wish for a status quo to continue after this genocide, I offer to break the myth of a liberal Zionism and maybe, just maybe, convert you into being an anti-Zionist. I'm going to be very upfront with you and clearly spell out to you why this video is worth a watch. This video is not just another history video on the history of political Zionism and its ultimate final boss form that is currently committing a genocide in Gaza. Rather, at the core of this video is anti-Zionism, and it argues for Palestinian liberation. However, to take on all of political Zionism is a daunting task. And the late and great scholar Edward Said once wrote, facing political Zionism for many academics is a terrain that is sensitive, and thus many do not tread. For a long time, I didn't tread as deep, and due to the lack of courage, I've made mistakes and aided the myth of a liberal Zionism. It was in fact curiosity that broke the illusion, but being wiser now, I tread into this terrain with caution and with the aid of my fellow anti-Zionist Jewish comrades. For those worried that this video, a video on political Zionism, has an anti-Semitic presence, fear not. Part of the reason Said said critiquing political Zionism is tricky for academics is the fear that they'll be convicted as anti-Semites. The anti-Semitic allegations thus serve as a shield for serious critique on an ideology that is known for betraying the Jewish people of Europe, for being besties with monstrous anti-Semites. And most of all, it's an ideology that has brought tremendous suffering and pain to the Palestinian people. For those who claim that anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism, they are often the ones that are ignoring the screams and the narratives of the victims of Zionism. Palestinians have a valid right to not only oppose political Zionism, but to utterly reject it and the idea of a Jewish majority ethno-state. The final caveat I need people to understand is that political Zionism was rejected by the Jewish people of Europe, who instantly saw its harms. They saw its aims to segregate Jews from their comrades, as Zionism was a counter-revolutionary force that never fought for Jewish emancipation and Jewish liberation. Rather, Zionism set out to aid anti-Semites and their pogroms in order to create an exclusively Jewish settler colonial state through the uses of violence. Political Zionism was never an antidote. It was never a cure to anti-Semitism, but poison to both Jewish and Palestinian people. To explain what I mean, let's begin in the present and face the myth head on. The current Gaza genocide that is being committed by the political Zionist state is not a policy decision that can simply be assigned to Netanyahu and the Zionist right wing. Rather, it's the crime of the Zionist apparatus, and it has millions of victims from the years of 1878 to 2024. liberals and some leftists quite easily fall for the myth of a liberal Zionism and aid the illusion liberal Zionists have built and maintained over the years. The liberals believe that the solution to Israel's long oppressive colonization of Palestine is not to end the colonial project that has ravaged the land and uprooted the indigenous population, but to simply and peacefully force the Netanyahu government to resign so that things can return back to normal, to a time when Israel oppressed Palestinians peacefully. They claim that the Israel that is killing thousands is not the civilized, peaceful Israel. It's not the true Israel. No. The true Israel oppresses Palestinians covertly and intelligently, and most of all, humanely. Thus, the liberal Zionists who have taken to the streets are not calling for a ceasefire. They are not calling for an end to this genocide, but rather they are angry at Netanyahu for failing to secure the colonial state and its settlers. Their solution is not to end the occupation, but to maintain it and fully secure it. Only when the colonial state is fully secure, Israel can coexist with their so-called barbarous neighbors. In the liberals' eyes, all that can be seen is an illusion that states Israel is a beacon of democracy that is surrounded by threatening regimes and bloodthirsty Palestinians. The true Israel has Western values, and it's the ultimate protector of Jewish people worldwide. And within this illusion is a sick denial that Israel is not colonizing Palestine. It is not a settler colonial fascist apartheid state, and the violence it commits, the massacres over the years, are purely in self-defense. It's a sick denial that silences the voices of the victims of Zionism, the Palestinian people. To see this illusion and to defend it so viscerally, liberals and some leftists alike buy into a carefully constructed myth of a liberal Zionism, a myth that proclaims, first and foremost, Israel is a peaceful, tolerant state that purely acts in self-defense, and that peace has never been achieved because there are apparently no partners in peace. These attitudes tie into the next myth. Liberal Zionists perceive themselves as part of the West, as part of Europe, as the Israeli scholar Loire illustrates here. Israel was supposed to be a white European fantasy in the Orient, yet the presence of Palestinians and having to be forced to bring Mizrahi Jews has wrecked this fantasy. Israeli scholars who have been critical of Zionism have discovered that inside of the apartheid system is a white supremacist social hierarchy where Jewish white Europeans sit on the top. Under them are the Mizrahi Jews, and at the very, very bottom of this hierarchy are the Palestinians. European Jewish settlers utterly despised being in a known Arab region, and thus since the beginning, Zionists saw themselves as Western, as European, serving as a bridge or an outpost for the West. These Western roots are clear, as when the Zionist state was being constructed, before it was ever called Israel, Zionist settlers were racist towards indigenous peoples, as Zionists perceived them as backwards, lazy, barbaric, violent, murderers, and people who despised peace. For the record, what peace really means here is not an equal coexistence, but the complete pacification of Palestinians who must surrender their lands, their history, their human rights, and armed resistance to have the privilege of living beside their colonizers. However, in the eyes of liberal Zionists, the rejection of the Jewish state and the rejection of surrendering to the colonial entity is akin to terrorism. And thus Israel is a beacon for anti-terrorism, as one just has to take a look at these magnificent apartheid walls, or the mass incarceration of women and children, to see the lengths Israel takes to subdue terrorism. On top of all of that, Israel has been long praised for having a democracy, one that is blatantly apartheid, as it's ruled by a Jewish majority. And to take part in the apartheid democracy, Palestinians must recognize and pledge their allegiance to the Jewish state of Israel. They must surrender their Palestinian nationalities, their history, and culture to become Israeli Arabs. For the Palestinians living under Israeli occupation are considered as internal enemies, internal threats. But these fascist tendencies the left unabashingly subscribes to are quickly wiped away and hidden by Israel's humanism and the small, little crowd of leftists who protest for human rights. However, in being apartheid, the left again subscribes to the idea that only Jewish people deserve human rights, while it is justified to deny Palestinians their human rights. The apartheid ethno-state nature of Israel makes it a heaven for any Jewish person who visits or settles, while the occupation makes it hell for Palestinians. The apartheid comes with a severe cost of suffering to the Palestinians. But again, Israelis cover their ears to the cries and the screams of the victims of Zionism. They cover their eyes to the horrors, but some revel in the destruction of Palestine. They revel in the bombings, the raids, in the discrimination, in the racism, in the death, and even in blockading food for the very people who they are starving. But that doesn't matter, because most of all, Israel stands as the protector of all Jewish people, despite being the best of friends with monstrous anti-Semites over the years, from Tsar Nicholas III and his ministers, to the pogromist Simon Petlira, to Mussolini, to Hitler, to the Hitler-loving Prime Minister of South Africa, Dr. D.F. Milan. And the list goes on and on and on and on and on. The final myth that gets projected by liberal Zionists that is eaten up uncritically is that the entire blame is placed on the right. All of the injustice, the occupation, the illegal settlements, the violence, the colonization, the massacres, the apartheid, all of it is the right's fault. And liberal Zionists are the good Zionists who promise to return things to the status quo. All of these myths have no legitimacy in reality. All of it is a revision of history. There is no sincere solidarity between those who are on the left with the victims of Zionism, for most of the suffering is repressed, silenced, and outlawed. In truth, the left has a long history as being brothers with the right, as they have been brothers in arms, both attempting to completely colonize Palestine, and they both pledge loyalty to the core values of Zionism. Before I give you a rundown of the long and boring history, let me serve you a small example in relation to the current genocide Israel is committing. To understand the myth of a liberal Zionism, one must understand two sides of liberal Zionists and their sympathizers. The first are the anti-Netanyahu protests, which to liberals in the West is a hopeful sign that this so-called conflict can end democratically. But if you examine these protests, they prove the left is not protesting to end the genocide or the occupation or even demand a ceasefire. They may look radical, but these people are not radically opposing their state. Rather than supporting Palestinians who are being murdered by taking direct action like organizing enough people to fight those who are blockading aid or impeding troops, they instead take to the streets in outrage towards Netanyahu. They are outraged because Netanyahu allowed October 7th to happen and that he failed to secure the homeland from Hamas. I won't get into liberal Zionism's obsession with security here, but keep in mind it was labor Zionists who built and implemented the apartheid walls. So, as much as they hate Netanyahu, these very same people take part in blaming the genocide, the starvation on Hamas, calling for Hamas to surrender, saying things like, if only Hamas didn't attack, or Hamas should lay their arms and we'll finally get peace, or the two-state solution is dead, Hamas killed it. The suffering, the starvation, and the death of Palestinians are not felt because that's simply a cost of security. On the other hand, leftist Zionists do take part in direct action, as for weeks now, they have joined their brothers on the right to prevent humanitarian aid from entering Gaza by blockading trucks, obeying an order given by their so-called enemies, the ultra-religious far right. The left is actively partaking in the genocide by starving Palestinians. They are
complicit.
And yet, I can already see it. The trucks are Hamas. The food is Hamas. Hamas should just hand over all the hostages and surrender for humanitarian aid, for basic human rights. It's vile. Zionism is poison, and it always has been. It's time to take a dive into the past and briefly take a peek at the origins of Zionism and the role of the left, or the ridiculous name they gave themselves, Labor Zionists. So this part isn't going to be like my last video where I get into the origins of Zionism. Rather, I'm going to use this opportunity to say the things I lacked the courage to say because I lacked an understanding. In my Palestine video, I get into the idea that before Herzl walked in, others laid down the foundations of political Zionism and its traditions. As UNRWA stresses, political Zionism's foundations were constructed off the Germanic Enlightenment, the racist social Darwinism of the time, and the Volkisch movement. A movement that professes that a people of common descent should gather and form a state. This basically means that political Zionism is the older brother of Nazism. For the Jewish folk in the audience who think this is an offensive statement, it's not, because it is a historical fact, and a fact that is important because it allows one to understand how Zionist colonization of Palestine differs from other settler colonial projects. So when Herzl and Weizmann took the stage calling for a Jewish nationalism based off blood, race, restoration of language, of land, and empire in their first Congress, they were instantly called anti-Semitic, friends of anti-Semites, and they were condemned by Jewish people all over Europe. Zionism did not initially latch on in European Jewish communities at the time because many saw Marxism as a tool of their liberation, and they were not interested in segregating themselves from the people who they lived alongside with and leaving their home countries to colonize Palestine. From its origins, one can see that political Zionism stood in direct opposition with actual leftist Jewish folks who were fighting against their oppressors and anti-Semitism. Marxism had resonated with Jewish communities throughout Europe as the solution to anti-Semitism was not segregation or colonization, but unity and solidarity with other oppressed peoples. In their eyes, overthrowing the people who oppressed them was the only way to attain equality and defeat anti-Semitism. Political Zionism stood for the opposite, and European Jews instantly understood that a segregationist stance would not aid them in liberation. They would stand corrected, as political Zionism has only fought a single time with oppressed Jewish people for their liberation. A single time in all of its existence. This is because at the heart of Zionism and Jewish nationalism was segregation, and those who rejected segregation were Zionism's ultimate enemies. Because instead of choosing segregation and settling in Palestine, socialist German and Russian Jews were building sophisticated networks of solidarity with their non-Jewish comrades, completely countering political Zionism. They sought revolution, and as revolution inched closer and closer, they began to trust Vladimir Lenin. Jewish revolutionaries who opposed Zionism were hated by Herzl. He called them assimilationists, emasculine for not taking on the nationalist colonial project, and other terrible offensive names that I can't say, and yet this is how Theodor Herzl, the father of Zionism, thought of his enemies and Jewish people who were on the front lines fighting for an anti-Semitic Russia. However, unlike Lenin, who promised to abolish anti-Semitism, political Zionists stood firmly in the belief that anti-Semitism was incurable and eternal. Due to this belief, Herzl would write that the true best friends of Zionism were the anti-Semites. In contrast to solidarity, political Zionism aided oppressors in dividing Jewish people from non-Jewish people to spark more severe pogroms. These pogroms were used to forcefully send displaced Jews to colonize and settle in Palestine. You might be thinking right now, oh lost futures, for the past few minutes you've been talking out of your ass. Zionism was a national liberation movement that sought to save Jewish people from anti-Semitic countries. But it wasn't. And there are a lot of concrete historical moments that would shed light on political Zionists being best friends with anti-Semites. In 1978, for an example, the first Zionist colony in Palestine was only set up because Russian pogroms that forced millions of Jewish people to flee Russia. Western anti-Semitic countries such as the UK did not allow them entry, as Arthur Balfour, the man who would write the colonial document enshrining a Jewish homeland into law, would say, "What would have befallen Britain from these Jews?" Working with an Edmund Rothschild, Balfour would send displaced Russian Jews to settle in Palestine. The success of sending displaced, oppressed Russian Jews to Palestine motivated Herzl to meet with the Tsar and his minister. Herzl did not ever condemn the pogroms. He did not ever back Jewish people who were fighting against their anti-Semitic government, but rather he tried to make a deal with the Tsar so that whenever a pogrom occurred, displaced Russian Jews would only be sent to Palestine. Are you starting to understand how fucked up political Zionism is? No? I really don't want to talk to you like you're a child or a baby, but here we go. You have a group of Jewish socialists, like Bund, for an example, who are fighting against the Tsar, who are living in ghettos, who are victims of slaughter and expulsion, and instead of aiding them, political Zionists sought to sabotage them and ally with the Tsar, being okay with the pogroms that were taking place because they aided their sick, disgusting, wretched colonial project. Once Herzl passed on and went to hell, Satan gifted the world Jabotinsky, who would inherit Herzl's friendship with anti-Semites. Jabotinsky thus ran counter-revolutionary to the Jewish Socialist Bund, trying his very best to recruit and divide the Jewish people of Russia. Political Zionists were very anti-revolution, and they tried to convince the oppressed to surrender their cause and settle in Palestine. Just go, just lay down your arms and go. However, political Zionists failed, as Bund, a socialist Jewish organization, was able to counter the Tsarist pogroms. They did this by organizing and fighting side by side with non-Jewish comrades. When the revolution succeeded and Lenin took power, he instantly abolished anti-Semitism. He brutally cracked down on any anti-Semitism. He destroyed the ghettos, and he elevated the Jewish people of Russia to full citizenship, and there was equality. Communism defeated anti-Semitism, not Zionism. But the story of political Zionism's origins, its friendly ties with anti-Semites, and the revolution did not end there. Political Zionism showed its fascist tendencies early as they joined the Russian White Army to fight and overthrow the Soviets. Many of the people who Zionists joined in the Russian Civil War were ex-pogromists who were very anti-Semitic and were disgusted with what Lenin had done. In truth, political Zionists were outraged that Russian Jews refused to leave the Soviet Union and chose to fight with the Soviets against the White Army. Like, yeah, duh. Of course they would leave. Like, yeah, duh. Of course they would refuse to leave their homes and switch sides to Zionism when they finally attained liberation and equality. But why would they ever switch sides and join Zionism when it was teaming up with their oppressors to restore a regime that mass murdered and expelled them? Let's wrap it up, since there are many more Zionisms to explore. The OG Zionists were racist. They were hungry for a colonial adventure, just starving. They believed that anti-Semitism could never be defeated, and the Jewish people of Europe will never attain liberation. No, Instead, liberation could only be achieved by creating a colonial state that was exclusive for Jewish people. The state was built with exclusion in mind, as methods to simply transfer the native populations were drawn as early as 1899. Those who went on to construct a Jewish national homeland through exclusion and segregation were the labor Zionists. Part of the OG Zionists were labor Zionists. Labor Zionists were a group of people who used a mixture of Jewish nationalism and socialism when constructing early settlements and developing the Jewish state of Israel. As Tikvahonig Parnas explains, labor Zionists were constructive socialists, a localized version of National Socialism. For a modern reference on constructivists, they resemble the current Nazbal movement. Now again, you might think I'm just saying this to be controversial or edgy, but I found a collective of scholars who arrived at a similar conclusion, 3 of them being Israeli historians who had reckoned with their past and took the analysis of George Habash and Ghassan Kanafani seriously. The foundations of labor Zionism are founded on the foundations of political Zionism, as if you remember, it was founded on the ideas of the Germanic Enlightenment and Germanic nationalism. Political Zionism also followed the Aryan race current by restoring the Hebrew language and sought to redeem the uncultured, uncivilized land of Palestine. Most of all, it was inspired by the Volkisch movement, a movement that professed a race should gather and form a state, not any kind of state, but an ethno-state. The Nazis, for an example, used both the Volkisch movement and the Aryan race theory to form a purely Aryan state, a purely German state. Thus, the apartheid found in South Africa and Israel stemmed from the Nazis and the Volkisch movement. Both political Zionism and labor Zionism desired to build a Jewish colony that was exclusively for Jews. The political Zionist settlers and leaders were deeply committed to a segregationist cause, that they forced segregation onto their settlements 30 years before the Nazis came to power. This segregation would be constructed on the ground by labor Zionists, who made it their mission to use socialism to dominate the labor of Palestine, which in turn robbed Palestinian labor and stole Palestinian land. Like the Nazis, who used National Socialism to colonize Slavic lands, labor Zionism used constructive socialism to colonize Palestine and reserve the benefits of socialism only to Jewish settlers. However, labor Zionism's initial colonization and their usage of National Socialism has been buried by myths. These myths paint labor Zionists as brave, adventurous pioneers who arrived at a desolate land and worked their butts off to make the desert bloom and built a socialist utopia for all the Jewish people of the world. They were not settlers, but harbingers of European enlightenment and civilization who were given the heavy tasks of filling the uncivilized land with European culture and to advance Palestinian society by totally destructing it and building a Jewish state on the ruins of a Palestinian nation. Political Zionists have always followed the Aryan and colonial current, as they justified their colonization by claiming that since Palestinian culture was not up to standards, it was justified for them to replace it with an elevated European culture. The native Palestinians were considered as inferior, obstacles, murderers, thieves, liars, lazy, backwards, barbarous, and undeserving of land. This dehumanization and the justification of conquest was not created by political Zionism, as they stole these attitudes from the British and used them to legitimize the crimes they were committing on Palestinian land. Edward Said cites a dozen of these British explorers and so-called intellectuals who followed the Aryan race current and used racial theories to assess the cultural state of Palestine. These foundations are important because they explain the many actions labor Zionists took from the years 1903 to 1977, Here's a couple of notable historical moments. First, prioritizing Jewish labor by waging a conquest of labor. This was done by excluding Palestinian labor. In the British-occupied Mandate Palestine, this meant that Jewish settlers had unions and workers' rights, while they took active measures to break Palestinian strikes and dwindle Palestinian labor to starve them. Second, Labor Zionists agreed with revisionists that Jewish settlements needed protection, and thus an underground Jewish security force was built. The Haganah forces were made up of Jewish settlers who were armed to protect Zionist settlements from Palestinian guerrilla attacks. In their ranks were revisionist Zionists who would splinter, forming terrorist organizations, but the Haganah would be the main leading force in the conquest of land. Third, during the Mandate era, it was Labor Zionists who implemented race laws, making it illegal for Jewish people to marry non-Jewish people to maintain their pure Jewish settlements. This was also to enforce segregation and prevent Jewish people from even intermingling with Palestinians. I stress this because it was not the revisionists who implemented race laws, although they are the Zionists famous for obsessing over racial purity. No. All political Zionists were pro-ethno-state. Fourth, in both the 1929 Arab riots and the 1936 Great Palestinian Uprising, Labor Zionists ordered the now legal Haganah troops to break strikes and join the British by terrorizing Palestinian citizens. Fifth, although during the Second World War, Labor Zionists sided with the British and opposed the revisionist alliances with Italy and Nazi Germany, yet they still took part in sabotaging Western countries from offering displaced Jewish people a safe haven in Western countries. Instead, they argued that displaced Jews must only go to Palestine, and they prioritized their colonial pet project over Jewish lives during the Holocaust. Sixth, the 1948 Nakba. All political Zionist camps took part in the planning and execution of what they called the transfer of 750,000 Palestinians, the destruction of over 500 villages, where over 22 massacres were committed. In my video on Palestine, I made the mistake of focusing only on revisionist violence and not on the details of the Nakba policy, the intentions behind those policies, and the orders Labor Zionists gave to Haganah, Irgun, and Lehi troops. Nur Wasallah has so kindly compiled a list of countless operations. The objective in all of them was to cleanse Palestine. It's almost like the Nakba was not a transfer or an evacuation, but a large-scale ethnic cleansing. The intentions behind the Nakba tie back to OG Zionist aspirations of creating a pure Jewish state and a homeland for all Jewish people. To achieve and maintain such a state required a Jewish majority, and in 1948, Zionist settlers made up of 18% of the total population. So how does one achieve a majority? How does one create and maintain an exclusively Jewish state? The answer is, and I hope by now you all know and you understand, is to ethnically cleanse the indigenous peoples of the land. The aim was to wipe clean their centuries-long cities, villages, burn down farms, commit over 22 massacres, and further outlaw Palestinians' right to return. Outlaw the very mention of Palestine, to commit an ethnic cleansing of Palestinian culture, and to deny their right to self-determination. That is how the tolerant, progressive, democratic, and Western state of Israel was founded. All of these crimes were championed by Labor Zionists, and they were the ones who carried on the repression. Seventh, after the Nakba, Labor Zionists and their new strong alliance with the right wing would implement policies to prevent a right to return. As I just said, they basically outlawed Palestine. Tied to these policies, the new baby state of Israel teamed up with the British bootlicking Jordan to make sure refugee camps were placed under heavy security and that every action these traumatized Palestinians made was policed. Yet in Syria, Egypt, and Lebanon, and in certain camps in Jordan, Palestinian resistance movements arose to face this oppression. The Palestinian struggle for liberation was heard throughout the world, as in the 1960s, the Japanese Red Army and their leader would travel to Beirut, joining the PFLP, fighting side by side with them. Although Israel and Jordan were brutal in putting down any resistance, the struggle gave Palestinians hope that the colonial state that was quickly stealing more and more of their land would one day fall. Eighth, when Israel was founded, the first nation to recognize and legitimize it was apartheid South Africa. Labour Zionists hailed the anti-Semite pro-Hitler president of South Africa and called him one of the greatest friends of Israel. Why did this Hitler stan love Israel so much? It's because he recognized game. Like legit, the president of South Africa admired Israeli apartheid so much that he would aid them whenever they called. In return, apartheid Israel was one of the greatest supporters of apartheid South Africa. And finally, a fuck ton of imperialism and expansion. In 1956, Egypt pulled a Chad move and nationalized the Suez Canal, telling the British to finally fuck off. This spurred the French and the British to immediately bomb and invade Egypt, using Israel as a forward operating base. But Israel wasn't happy just being an FOB and invaded Gaza and the Sinai Peninsula. In Gaza, they would butcher and massacre Palestinians. Two surviving children who witnessed the murder of their elders would be co-founders of Hamas. This occupation lasted for a year. However, in 1967, after switching patrons to the USA, Israel wished to aid America in overthrowing the Syrians, who were developing close ties to the Soviets. And so America decided to rely on Israel to invade Syria to overthrow the Syrian government. But Egypt quickly learned about the possible invasion of their bestie and began to militarize to defend Syria. So Israel, the little victim, waged war with Egypt, feeling threatened. And this would become the infamous 6 Days War, which is now often told as a story of Syrian and Egyptian aggression against Israel. In being the victor, Israel occupied the West Bank, Gaza, and the Sinai again, but this time for over 20 years, enforcing a brutal military occupation. Labour Zionists went so far to repress any resistance to their occupation by implementing a broken bones policy, where the IOF would raid houses at random, crushing the bones of young and old men. The imperialist endeavors would continue as Israel has dabbled in helping America overthrow socialist governments in Latin America. Are you noticing a trend here where so-called socialist Zionists have a history of behaving like fascists? As they not only championed the colonial mission, implemented policies that cemented apartheid, but it's also a state that seeks expansion. These are supposed to be the good Zionists, and yet every action the Labour Zionists committed reverberate and affect the present. What I want you to get out of this absurdly long list is something Edward Said stresses in his writings. The screams and the cries of the victims of Zionism have long been silenced and muffled by Israel and Western countries. It's a silence that would carry on when revisionists took power in 1977 and in 1981 when there was a grand coalition where Labour Zionists, Socialist Zionists, left-wing Zionists teamed up with the right-wing revisionist Likud party. Like, what the fuck, dude? I hope at this point of the video I've broken a few myths and I've educated you a tiny little bit. We now turn to revisionist Zionism, who are completely different from Labour Zionists to a degree. And that degree is, while Labour Zionists oppressed, implemented racist apartheid policies, desired a Jewish majority, and led the colonization effort, they did all these things while covering their tracks. They waited patiently for Britain to weaken the Palestinians and hid their expansionist apartheid policies with a veneer of self-defense. The revisionists were not so coy. They are brutally honest about what they are and what they want. So it's time to revive Jabotinsky and Menachem Begin from hell. But don't worry, I'm gonna toss him back in immediately.
Why are we still here? Just to suffer. Every night.
they're also fascist. Moving on. Just kidding. In 2021, when the Al-Aqsa Mosque was being raided by Israeli forces and Gaza was being bombed, I was deeply enraged, and I admittedly knew nothing about political Zionism. So I picked up the wrong book and read it and wrote a shitty video about Revisionist Zionism. It was about how Revisionist Zionism had ties to fascism, but I also went into how the Holy Land belongs to all religions and people. However, looking back at it, I cringe because I bought and aided the myth of a liberal Zionism. I naively thought that if Revisionist Zionism was fascist, then this labor Zionism the author praises must be the good Zionism, when it clearly isn't. There is no good Zionism. This subchapter exists to simply bash on my good and very dead enemy, Vladimir Hitler Jabotinsky. I didn't make this nickname up, this is what labor Zionists called him. This subchapter will also cover Menachem Begin, as both of these men would go on to influence Netanyahu. So, Jabotinsky was basically the Ben Shapiro of his time. He was a deep admirer of Herzl, and he wanted to follow in his footsteps and carry on his legacy and his friendships with anti-Semites. Jabotinsky, like Herzl, was very anti-assimilation. He was very anti-socialist. He was very anti-communist. He was very anti-revolution, and he was very anti-Jewish liberation. Basically, the real Jewish socialists who were fighting alongside their socialist comrades in arms to overthrow the Tsar hated him, and he wept when his country overthrew the people who were oppressing his people for hundreds of years and became communist. He differed slightly from Herzl in his early years, as Jabotinsky openly meddled in race science, stating that the Jewish race was pure because Judaism forbid Jews from marrying and intermingling with non-Jews, thus making them Aryan, and that since they were a chosen people, their conquest of Palestine was justified. Most historians who study Jabotinsky and Revisionist Zionism split it in three eras. The first began when Jabotinsky was trying to be an OG Zionist and spent most of his pathetic life trying to convince Russian Jews to stop resisting, to stop organizing, and just flee to Palestine. In this time frame, Jabotinsky would beg the World Zionist Organization to convince Britain to form a Jewish legion to conquer, fight in Palestine. At first, the labor Zionists didn't take him too seriously, as the settlements were failing, but they eventually thought that having a Jewish legion fight in Palestine, they would appear as liberators, as strong, masculine Jews. So Jabotinsky enlisted, and the British dragged his ass all over the Middle East, where he complained about the heat and wept about missing Europe, missing civilization, and European culture. When he was stationed in Palestine, he didn't feel anything, he didn't write anything, he didn't connect with his so-called indigenous land. Rather, he complained about the heat and how uncivilized and rude the Palestinians were to their occupiers. After the war ended, the British wanted to disband the Legion because they didn't really do anything. But Jabotinsky confronted the World Zionist Organization, telling them that settlers needed the Legion for defense. Blah 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 blah, self-defense. The Jewish Legion was disbanded, and Jabotinsky wept at the loss of glory. The glory of conquering Palestine and Transjordan. There is grounded historical evidence of this, as in 1923, Jabotinsky would write the very colonial article calling for an iron wall, where he called on Zionist settlers to arm themselves, and the need of the British to crush Palestinian resistance and eliminate any hope of being liberated from their colonizers. The Iron Wall doctrine has influenced Israeli policy, but it has never succeeded, and it will eventually crumble. However, Jabotinsky was a man of action, so he set up a secret, illegal defense force. And the labor Zionists also agreed to the need of having security, and the soldiers who fought in the occupation of Palestine in World War I joined the Haganah and other underground terrorist organizations. The British would soon find evidence learning that Jabotinsky used his European ties to illegally ship and smuggle weapons to mass-armed settlers. He was thus arrested and put into prison where he belonged. Although the World Zionist Organization and Labor Zionists had his back and immediately freed him, allowing him to leave Palestine unharmed, once he was out, the British barred him from ever entering Palestine. This did not stop Jabotinsky, who began to become distant from his Zionist peers. He instead went to Italy, absorbing the fascism around him, and yet at this time period, he seemed to have a disdain for fascism. Jabotinsky would travel the world, being very unpopular in Britain and America, but he found his ground in Poland, where he thought himself as Moses. He thought he was destined to lead Jewish people and shepherd them away from the terrifying beast, communism. In thinking he was Moses, he tried in many attempts to radicalize the World Zionist Organization and take drastic measures to expel the British and Palestinians. He resigned 3 times whining because he failed each time. Again, Labor Zionists were very patient, waiting for the right time to strike, and to them, Jabotinsky wasn't all that smart. In 1921, Jabotinsky would make a desperate attempt to bounce back from these political failures by going above the World Zionist Organization to create an alliance with the Ukrainian pogromists, who from the years 1917 to 1920 slaughtered 30,000 Ukrainian Jews. Facing the remnants of the Tsarist regime, Jewish people of Ukraine chose to flee to Russia than be massacred. So where did Jabotinsky fit in? In 1921, Ukrainian nationalists were planning to invade Soviet Ukraine, where they predicted pogroms would occur because Ukrainian Jewish people had little trust in Ukrainian nationalists after 30,000 of them were mass murdered. So Jabotinsky appeared to help the Ukrainian nationalists. His plan follows as such. Basically, Jabotinsky would organize a Jewish armed police force who would invade with the Ukrainian nationalists and prevent any Ukrainian pogroms. Jabotinsky used his power to sign the Slavinsky-Jabotinsky Agreement and made a pact with the devils. The border raid failed in October and the pact faded into oblivion, but it had destroyed Jabotinsky's name. He was seen as a fool and a traitor. Eventually, no one cared about Jabotinsky. His Russian peers left him, few would ever attend his speeches, and no one got his love for Zionism. Jabotinsky could have just disappeared right here and lived a normal life with his wife and son, but in the times when fascism was rising, and oddly in a party in Latvia, he was told by the youth that other political Zionists didn't get him and his flirtations with fascism. What political Zionism needed was a strong man, a leader, a person who could make the will of the youth into one driving force. And this is when Jabotinsky had his fascist awakening. Before he went full revisionist, he was stormed into a World Zionist Organization Congress with his youth surrounding him, dressed in black shirts, resembling the Nazis, which outraged political Zionist leaders. But he was still unpopular and not enough of a force to change things. So did he give up? No. The second phase historians study are Jabotinsky's years as the leader of the Revisionist Zionists, the books and the articles he wrote, and his continued friendships with anti-Semites. Jabotinsky first founded Beitar, a revisionist Zionist youth group that would train and radicalize the youth of Poland to prepare them to fight and conquer Palestine. Beitar was based off other fascist youth groups, as he was deeply inspired by Mussolini's fascism. In his book Samson, Jabotinsky would write about the hypnotizing power of a leader who commands his people's actions and thoughts under a singular will. This is the type of leader Jabotinsky imagined himself to be. The fascist-like terror that his organization Irgun brought to Palestine stemmed from what he preached to the youth of Beitar. First, to restore the empire of ancient Israel, as Palestine wasn't enough, and Jordan also needed to be conquered. Second, Palestinians were deserving of death because they were a lesser race, and are responsible for the 2,000-year downfall of ancient Israel. Jabotinsky taught his children that Palestinians are monsters, thieves, killers of Jews, that they corrupted their lands, and that they needed to be exterminated. Finally, Jabotinsky stressed and implemented racial purity, making it so his followers would not intermingle with their so-called enemies, and further, not to intermingle with non-European Jewish people. Jabotinsky gave Erdogan the mission to expel the British terrorized Palestinians and prepare themselves to conquer both Palestine and Jordan. After the 1936 Palestinian Great Uprising, Erdogan and Lehi would finally move into action, terrorizing and murdering Palestinians from 1938 to 1948 and beyond. Labor Zionists never condemned the terrorism because it was in the name of self-defense and settler security. Before he finally died and was sent to hell, Jabotinsky would first bolster relations with Mussolini's Italy so that expelled Jews would only be sent to Palestine. Jabotinsky has gone on the record defending Mussolini's fascism. He would build better schools in Italy to train Jewish revisionists of Italy and prep them for their arrival in Palestine. At the eve of the Second World War, Jabotinsky inked his worst take. He predicted that the Nazis would never invade Poland, that Europe will not have a Second World War, but then it happened. Jabotinsky inked another, even worse take, as he called it, a phony war. However, once he was wrong, and the Nazis went on their rampage, Jabotinsky saw the Second World War like the first. It was the perfect opportunity to build back the Jewish army and fight the Nazis. So in his last year, he toured America, where he died and was sent to hell, where he now burns with Hitler, Mussolini, and Franco. Although his last acts were good, his followers refused to fight the Nazis and would instead ally themselves with them. This is because revisionist Zionists are fascists too. Before we move on to Begin, Israelis now see Jabotinsky not as a fascist, but as a hero, a great leader, when in reality, what Jabotinsky preached to his children led to countless massacres in Palestine, and the person who would lead Beitar and Erdogan after his death was none other than Menachem Begin. The third era historians of revisionist Zionism study are the years of Begin. Menachem Begin grew up as a deep admirer and was a Jabotinsky stan. At the age of 17, he would join Beitar and absorbed all the fascism the organization had to offer, eventually becoming its leader at the age of 25. Begin followed Jabotinsky's tradition, as Beitar showed little to no solidarity with the Jewish left of Poland, even when the Nazis were invading. Instead of joining the resistance, revisionist leaders used their European ties to instantly flee Poland and try to find passage to Palestine. Begin would later revise these events by proclaiming that he was a victim of the Holocaust, when in reality he abandoned the Jews of Poland to die. When he got to Latvia, the Soviets instantly arrested him, and Begin goes off in his books writing about the monstrous anti-Semitic communists, when he was not arrested because he was Jewish, but because of his ties to the fascist Jabotinsky, who had long been shunned from ever entering the USSR. The Soviets were kind and let him go after a few months of labor. Anywho, the Soviets got tired of Begin and shipped him off to Palestine, where he was instantly welcomed into the ranks of Erdogan. During the Second World War, Erdogan, Lehi, and Labor Zionists would each play their parts, sabotaging American efforts to provide displaced Jews a safe haven in other Western countries. The Labor Zionists politically maneuvered with their British and American ties to send displaced Jews only to Palestine. On the other hand, Erdogan and Lehi tried to form alliances with the fascist states, continuing the long Zionist tradition of befriending anti-Semites and using Jewish suffering to send them only to Palestine. These alliances were called the 1933 Havara Transfer Agreement and the 1940 Jerusalem Agreement with Mussolini. Why only Palestine? As I said in earlier subchapters, all political Zionists believed in the idea of anti-assimilation, which basically is the anti-Semitic way of saying Jewish people cannot live alongside non-Jewish people because of anti-Semitism, which is, as you remember, is incurable and eternal. But underneath that logic is the belief that Jewish people differ from non-Jewish people as they are racially different and there is a biological hatred. Thus, to protect Jewish people, there needs to be a Jewish homeland that is ruled by a majority, which all of this is false and incredibly offensive. In being allies with the Axis, both Lehi and Iran would attack the British, who were staying in Palestine to protect them and to protect their occupation. These two violent militant organizations competed with each other, trying to see who was the best terrorist group. The Lehi would assassinate the British Minister of the Middle East, Lord Monet, who stood his ground against Zionist anti-assimilation. But in 1944, Iran, led by Begin, would revolt against the British, which was suppressed. But Begin and his gang would just get a slap on the wrist for being bad. Just really bad. How dare you? You know, we're not gonna punish you or anything. No, that was bad. Don't behave yourself, you know? In 1948, before the Nakba began, Ben-Gurion, the leader of the Labor Zionists, approached Begin to unite forces and transfer Palestinians. Thus, Iran allied itself with the Haganah, illustrating that the massacres Iran committed were not random terrorist attacks, but they were part of a grander ethnic cleansing strategy. Although Thomas Loire shows the true face of revisionist Zionism in the Years of Terror, most historians look at the Deir Yassin massacre. Begin ordered his troops to shoot and kill all enemies. Thus they entered the village and went door to door, killing anything that moved. Men, women, children, old and young. All were killed because all were the enemy. After the news broke out about the massacre in Deir Yassin, Begin was never punished, and rather it was the Labor Zionists in power who attempted to erase all records of the massacres and clear the pattern of genocide. After the Nakba, Iran was formally integrated into the IDF, and whenever Labor needed support, the revisionists were there to back them. In 1977, Begin, once a leader of a terrorist organization, became the Prime Minister of Israel, and his first act as Prime Minister was to hang a portrait of his hero, his leader, Jabotinsky, in his office. Liberals now look at the Likud Party as this ultra-right-wing party that differs from Labor Zionism, but Begin and his Likud Party continued Labor Zionism's mission, and when Begin lost the 1982 election, the Labour Party brought him in as the Minister of Defense. In truth, Labour and the revisionists since 1942 have been brothers in arms trying to achieve the vision of Zionism, to continue building the Iron Wall and conquer all of Palestine, to ethnically cleanse Palestinians, to expand the state, and to maintain a Jewish majority forever. It's about time we face the final boss again. Religious Zionism, or Theocratic Zionism, is one of the OG Zionisms, but I'm sandwiching them here because of flow. Political Zionism stole the core desires of religious Zionists and integrated it into their Zionism to recruit any Jewish person who was religious. I know I never explained what political Zionism is and the myth of its desires, and there's a good reason to that. Before political Zionists, Zionism was not a settler colonial project, but a simple return to Zion. So Theodore Herzl and Jabotinsky worked their butts off by working with anti-Semitic ministers of Imperial Russia because they had a large concentration of religious Jews. But the funny thing was that most Orthodox Jewish people in Europe and Palestine were anti-Zionist. They thought it was utterly ridiculous to move their Jewish communities based in Europe to Palestine. European Orthodox Jews were hated by political Zionists, and this hatred is still prevalent in the present as some American Orthodox Jews challenge political Zionism and the settler colonial state of Israel. On the other hand, Orthodox Jewish people in Palestine refuse to segregate and move into pure Jewish settlements. They had lived for centuries as neighbors with Muslims and Christian Palestinians and found little to no value in leaving their ancestral homes to move to a scrappy settlement. Further, Orthodox Jews and Jewish people who integrated into Arab societies were perceived as barbaric in comparison to European secular Zionist settlers. When Israel forced Mizrahis to flee their Arab countries through the use of terror, they became second-class citizens who needed to be re-educated and civilized. Israel is incredibly racist, as Ashkenazi Jews called Mizrahis the N-word and placed them in ghettos. They were segregated from Ashkenazi neighborhoods and were often given the dirty jobs of building the state. In truth, Israel did not force Mizrahi Jews to immigrate to Palestine because of the anti-Semitism in so-called Muslim countries, but to bolster the Jewish majority because European and American immigration slowed down well after World War II. I'm getting a bit sidetracked, but Mizrahis eventually formed the Israeli Black Panther Party and rioted. They stood in solidarity with Palestinians because the white supremacist nature of Israel oppresses everyone who is not from a Euro-American background. The riots were repressed, by the way, and crushed, putting Mizrahis back in their so-called proper place. And thus, the Mizrahis took their revenge on labor Zionists by supporting the ultra-religious parties. However, the most extreme and devoted religious Zionists followed political and labor Zionists, helping early on by filling settlements. Political Zionists who were secular desperately needed religion to legitimize their settler colonial project, and thus they preached that Jewish people had a divine DNA passport to Palestine, that they were mandated from heaven to return, and that they will restore the third temple. And religious Zionists loved it, but so did Christian Zionists. Which is odd, right? Don't you think that's kind of odd? Don't you think that's really odd that the Christian Zionists, that there are Christian Zionists? Yeah, man. Yeah, it's all really fucking odd. So in 1948, when the settler colonial state was born, political Zionists inked in the Constitution that Israel was the Jewish state. And thus, secular Zionist settlers did not create a secular state, but rather created a Judaic theocratic state. This in turn gave religious Zionists privileges in society, and the Bible became a valid history textbook. Since the founding of the state to the present, the Bible has been taught in all Israeli schools to legitimize the ancient mythic Israeli past. The privileges given to religious Zionists also enabled them to slowly gain power, and after Israel occupied the West Bank in 1967, it was religious Zionists who were on the front lines building settlements and stealing Palestinian lands. You might think that labor Zionists and later the liberal Zionists, who are secular, would have opposed the religious right. But religious Zionists had tremendous value for being settlers who dared to cross new frontiers and settle on new, stolen land. They're upheld as new, brave pioneers. And big names within the labor Zionist camp would also call them brothers in arms, because they all had the same objective: conquer all of Palestine, ethnically cleanse it, and convert the land by using Judaism. In recent years, the ultra-fascist religious right has been on the rise in Israel, but they didn't just randomly appear like a smash ultimate new challenger, but they were bolstered by the labor Zionist government who aided their settlements from 1982 to 2001 and beyond. Currently, the Minister of Defense is a religious Zionist who, like Begin, is praising the massacres his army is committing in Gaza. But who do you think is giving the IDF the order to kill all civilians, to starve all Palestinians? Is it really a singular man? A liberal Zionist would naively place the blame on the ultra-fascist religious right, but I wish to remind you that Israel is governed by a Jewish majority, meaning all Zionist parties are complicit in the orders given to the IDF. They are all complicit in this genocide. Anyways, the point of this subchapter is to say, since its inception, Israel has been a theocratic state that has tied itself to Judaism, and it has poisoned it. They are the Jewish homeland, the Jewish state. They desire for a Jewish majority. They Judaize the land. Their main language is Hebrew, which they brought back to life and revived to replace Yiddish. They have a right of return, allowing any Jewish person to freely immigrate to occupied Palestine, buy real estate, and steal Palestinian land. And finally, they claim to be the protectors of all Jewish people. So for a common Muslim who looks at the state of Israel, and there's a 99% chance they haven't spent 30 days plus locked in a room researching political Zionism, it's easy to mistake political Zionism as an extension of Judaism when it's not. And I repeat this to any Muslim viewer in my audience. Political Zionism is not an extension of Judaism. The confusing thing is, Zionists sure claim that their ideology is an extension of Judaism, and thus any valid critique on Zionism is anti-Semitic, when in reality it is not an extension of Judaism. As other Israeli scholars have noted, political Zionism has used Judaism as a tool of settler colonialism, and it has poisoned it. This is why in the present you have some Orthodox American Jews standing up against Israel, standing up for their beliefs, and they refuse to take part in genocide. They refuse to be complicit in this genocide. So, yeah, fuck political Zionism. We now turn back to the myths. A myth that Israel is a secular, progressive, democratic, Western, tolerant, and peaceful state that has been so well maintained by the final boss, the liberal Zionists. During the 1982 Israeli invasion of Lebanon, there emerged a new form of labor Zionism, one that was for peace.
Israel wants peace.
We will act until we can achieve peace and quiet, peace and quiet, peace and quiet, peace and quiet, peace and quiet.
After the siege of Beirut, the PLO surrendered, and liberal Zionists naively believed that the era of peace and quiet emerged. For them, peace meant a total suppression of Palestinian resistance and forcing Palestinians to submit to Israeli demands. In reality, there was no peace after the PLO surrendered, as their surrender led to the Sabra and Shatila massacres ordered by the Labor Zionist government. Massacres that Israel attempted to hide from the world as they celebrated the surrender of the PLO and the possibility of peace. In the Oslo years, liberal Zionists raged and fully supported their governments in making peace with the PLO, and yet Arafat was continuously called Hitler for requesting a liberated occupied West Bank, for a Palestinian state to exist without recognizing Israel, and for a right to return. You know, the basic shit. Liberal Zionists, these democratic, human rights, humane, tolerant people, rioted at these requests and popularized the slogan, "There are no partners in peace," which is a funny slogan, right? As when the Oslo negotiations were happening, Israel just so happened to build new settlements in the West Bank and quickly populate them. Around these new settlements and all settlements built on the land of Palestine were the myth that people didn't live there. In truth, Palestinians lived and occupied all of the lands before Zionist settlers arrived. So where did the Palestinians go? According to the myth, they just poofed away. In my last video, I bash Arafat, claiming that he suddenly gave up on the resistance, but for a few years he stood unshaken and demanded Palestinian rights, while Israel killed more and more of his people. The thing is though, one cannot make peace with their colonizers, because even in so-called peaceful times, Israel has always committed violent acts, because that's the natural nature of a settler colonial state. read some goddamn Fana. And if you doubt me, read some goddamn Fana or watch this documentary on decolonization to learn more.
National liberation, national renaissance, the restoration of nationhood to the people. Whatever may be the headings used or the new formulas introduced, decolonization is always a violent phenomenon.
Most liberal Zionists are fully aware about what their state is and its history of ethnic cleansing, mass murder, and genocide. But their main mission is to cover that side of Israel and presents to the world an Israel that is this peace-loving country that kills and murders and imprisons women and children, only does so for security reasons and not because it's a genocidal colonial state. No. The Palestinians are all terrorists. They are barbarians at the gate, and they are the greatest threat to the Jewish homeland. So Israel must keep its majority. It must only be ruled by the majority. It must maintain its apartheid legal and physical natures. It must continue to build security settlements. It must continue to build apartheid walls. It must continue to bomb Gaza. It must continue to starve Gaza. It must continue to raid Palestinian villages. It must continue to kidnap and imprison any Palestinian who dares to resist. It must continue to eradicate all of Palestine, all in the name of peace and security. In this video, I've covered most of these things, but I continuously brush past the idea of an Israel that is democratically governed by a Jewish majority. As I said early in this video, OG Zionists were obsessed with having a state that was purely Jewish, a state that was exclusively for Jewish people. The state's founding documents even refer to Israel as the Jewish homeland. If someone immigrates to occupied Palestine, they must swear allegiance to Zionism and recognize Israel as the Jewish homeland. For Palestinians to be considered as citizens who are loyal to the state that occupies them, they must swear allegiance to Zionism and recognize the state of Israel. Now, this might seem obvious, but in doing this, the Palestinian is forced to toss their identity and accept their colonizers. Many refused, and many still refuse. If a liberal Zionist made it this far, they're probably typing something like, "But don't you see, Lost? Israel is democratic." But it's not. Palestinians are first governed by the military, who can execute any Palestinian. This is evident in the many street executions Subdeep Sen has recorded. Palestinians cannot buy land or extend their lands. And when a Palestinian case makes it to the Supreme Court, the court always favors the Israeli government. In truth, Israel is governed by a Jewish majority, and over the years, liberal Zionists have begun to fear Palestinian birth rates. I'm sure you've all seen Ben Shapiro and Jordan Peterson share this graph to debunk the very true claim that there is a genocide in Gaza. However, Israelis have long feared what they call a Palestinian replacement. For an example, in the early 2000s, liberal Zionists realized that if they did not manage the Palestinian population, Israel would eventually crumble. They began drawing maps to sterilize Palestinian women, or commit a second Nakba. At the heart of the idea of having a Jewish majority are the basis of having an ethno-state that oppresses Palestinians with apartheid. But as long as Palestinians have hope, the Israeli state will take active measures to extinguish it. For those liberal Zionists who are hopeful for a two-state solution, or for those who want a future non-Zionist Jewish state, both are impossible, and Israel's genocide in Gaza proves this. They will continue to ethnically cleanse Palestinians until all of Israel is pure. The two-state solution for Israelis does not mean two independent states that neighbor each other, but a fully dominated and pacified Palestinian state. As for a non-Jewish state that serves as a haven for Jewish people, which at the heart of it sounds innocent, but what you're asking for is again an ethno-state that is ruled by a majority and will have to enforce apartheid on the minority. Before I offer you any solutions, let's wrap this long chapter up. Liberal Zionists are the final boss because they take Israel's brutal history and brush it with a humane paint. They construct a facade, a myth, And although some are ignorant of their history and the crimes Israel has committed since it came into being, liberal Zionists deny complacency and deny the role they, as settlers, play in genocide. It's utterly disgusting. In the present, liberal Zionists are thus not standing side by side with Palestinians, nor are they taking any direct action to stop this genocide, but rather most agree with Netanyahu, because Hamas is a security threat. So they march and they chant about democracy, peace, and humanity, when they're actually chanting, "We want the status quo. We want peace," by totally suppressing Palestinian terrorism. But not like this. No. Through humane, covert methods. What they actually care about isn't Palestinian lives. It isn't that their own state is committing a genocide. It isn't that there are thousands of Palestinians in prison. It isn't that every day a Palestinian is executed in the West Bank and Gaza. And it isn't that for every day for the last 75 years, Palestinians have had their villages raided and have been under military rule. But that Netanyahu is ruining the brand of Israel. That Netanyahu has destroyed the face of Israel and destroyed the myth of peace. Despite the actions of the world, liberal Zionists will continue to spread the fake lie that Israel is a peaceful, democratic nation. And as long as they support their settler colonial states and they are loyal to Zionism, they have blood on their hands and they are complacent in this genocide. So to any liberal Zionists out there, fuck you and fuck Israel. You're not peaceful, you're not democratic. And if you see yourself as a leftist who believes in decolonization, liberation, human rights, dignity, and are anti-imperialist, do not take to the streets waving the Israeli flag, but question your beliefs and take a stand. Tear down the state of Israel. You can refuse to be complacent in this genocide, and although it's illegal to be an anti-Zionist in the state of Israel, fight Zionism, because this should make you angry. It should shatter your heart. It should make you feel guilty because you are a witness in this genocide and you've played your part in supporting it. I'm gonna wrap this chapter up with this. In the 1960s, there emerged a communist Israeli organization who learned the truth about the Nakba by scouring British archives that kept record of how Israel was founded. They were called Metzpen. Metzpen, since its origins, was anti-Zionist. It refused to be complacent in Israeli war crimes. They were quickly repressed, and anti-Zionism was outlawed. It sounds very democratic, but I want anyone still watching is this. Yes, this is a heavy history. Yes, it sucks learning about the war crimes your settler colonial state committed, but many before you have stood witness to this bloody history and chose to stand in solidarity with Palestinians. Wherever you are, this is it. This is the time we stand and fight against political Zionism. It's time for it to end. It's time for political Zionism to be Luffy punched into oblivion, and to defeat political Zionism, one cannot be a liberal Zionist, but an anti-Zionist. Anti-Zionism is a core part of Palestinian national liberation. The very word anti-Zionism strikes fear in Israeli settlers, Christian Zionists, and Jewish people who have been indoctrinated by the Zionist mythos. In 1969, the New York Times published an article on the thing it called New Anti-Semitism. It claimed that the Black Panthers and their struggle against colonialism, imperialism, and Zionism, it was all anti-Semitic. Anti-Zionism from then on became framed as a hateful, leftist ideology that sought to destroy Israel and commit a second Holocaust. Although anti-Zionism does seek to destroy Israel by dismantling Zionism and the settler colonial apparatus, it has never called people to start mass murdering Jewish people, nor is it pro-genocide of any kind. Rather, it calls for a democratic, secular Palestinian state where all people are equal. And the PFLP has called on the Muslims, Christians, Jewish, and secular Palestinians to join the struggle and fight for liberation. The PFLP has also stressed that there's a need for a global movement to counter political Zionism and American imperialism. Any person is welcomed in the struggle, and anyone who opposes America and Zionism are considered as allies of the PFLP. In the 1960s, long before Ilan Pappé became an anti-Zionist, before Hyman Loomer called for a struggle against Zionism, and around the time Mezpen was founding, it was George Habash and Ghassan Kanafani who outlined the principles of anti-Zionism as an anti-colonial and an anti-imperial struggle for liberation. Both Palestinian leaders of the PFLP realized that political Zionists were not their only enemies, but rather Palestinians were fighting against American imperialism, what they called world Zionism, and reactionary Arab leaders.
At the present moment, no. At the present moment, we should only be concerned with the American people. And we are against any relations, official relations, with the United States of America. Because we know that what we are facing here is actually American imperialism and not only Israel. All the raids we are facing in the Lebanon and before that in Palestine, we know that Israel is actually able to practice such bad deeds because of American backing of Israel. We want this to be very, very, very clear. And we in the PFLP, we always stress that our real enemy is not Israel only and Zionism. It is American imperialism who is backing Israel because Israel is playing a bodyguard for American imperialistic interests in Saudi Arabia and in the Gulf region. That is why we don't want at the present moment, and we refuse any relations with the American government.
The works of George Habash and Ghassan Kanafani impacted Israeli and Jewish perceptions on Zionism. This is because their words stemmed directly from the eyes of the victims of Zionism. It enabled others who were not affected to understand the oppression that was being covered by labor Zionists. Thus, the Black Panthers, the Japanese Red Army, the Israeli Black Panthers, and Mezpen, all at some point stood in solidarity with the PFLP and joined the Palestinian struggle against political Zionism. Later on, Jewish and Israeli scholars would follow, such as the American Jewish scholar Hyman Loomer, Ilan Pappé, Loire, Lenny Brenner, and Tikvahonik Parnas. All would criticize Israel and take an anti-Zionist stance. Tikvahonik Parnas, in my opinion, surpasses all of her Jewish peers, as she personally took part in the Nakba, and she gets into the amnesia and the highs that was felt conquering Palestine, and has spent years reflecting on what the fuck Israel did in 1948.
אני אלחוטאית, אני לא ממש משתתפת בכיבוש, אני מגיעה לכל מקום יומיים שלושה אחרי הכיבוש. הכיבוש היה תוך מספר ימים. ואני מגיעה, וזה לא אומר לי כלום. זאת אומרת, אומר לי הניצחון, אבל לא אומר לי כל עניין הגירוש, כל עניין הבריחה. זה בכלל לא מלא תפקיד בעיניי. הייתי לפני זה, כשהייתי בחיש, הייתי בארזה. מלמטה היה הכפר קולוניה, שאנחנו ירינו עליהם והם ירו עלינו. ויום אחד בעיר לא היה יותר קולוניה. זה לא נרשם, זה didn't register, זה לא היה לזה משמעות. אני אתן לך דוגמה עד היכן הגיעה הדהומניזציה. לפני כמה שנים נסעתי מירושלים לתל אביב עם מחמוד עווארי, שהוא פלסטיני מ-48, גמר כאן את האוניברסיטה העברית, עשה עכשיו דוקטורט באנגליה. והוא ארכיאולוג, והוא השתתף בתוכנית של פייסל חוסייני על אזכור היסטוריה של הכפרים שנהרסו ב-48. ואנחנו עוברים על יד סריש שבו הייתי, בפלמח. והוא אומר לי, כאן ממול היה כפר ערבי. הוא לא התכוון לקולוניה שזה מימין, הוא התכוון לכיוון ההפוך, האחר. ואני אומרת, לא היה כאן שום כפר ערבי. הוא אומר, תקווה, אני יודע הנה, שמו היה כך וכך, והיא סבבה שתיקה, כי אני הייתי בטוחה שאני זוכרת שלא היה שם שום כפר ערבי. וכך אנחנו נוסעים כמה קילומטרים, ופתאום מנבחי הנשייה, מאיזה שהם מעמקים של הדחקה נוראה, אני אומרת לו, אוי, אתה צודק. היה כאן כפר...
In the eyes of even Jewish and Israeli anti-Zionist scholars, liberal and left-wing Zionism are not actually anti-Zionists, and they would never take a principled stance and join the resistance. Rather, these so-called leftists would aid and maintain the status quo of the oppression and the apartheid. This is because the so-called citizens of Israel are settlers who reject their position, they reject the history of colonization, and they reject that by being on Palestinian land, they are aiding the settler colonial state and its oppression of Palestinians. The PFLP's early works, tied with Nur Musalla and Faiz Saih, make an excellent pairing if one wishes to learn more about Zionist colonization, why this colonization must be resisted, and why political Zionism must be dismantled for actual peace to emerge. Lumer, like Kanafani and Habash, calls onto Jewish people to unite against Zionism, because as he writes, it's poisonous, not only to Palestinians, but Jewish people too. Political Zionism attempts to indoctrinate Jewish minds with its anti-Semitism. It aims to strike fear into the hearts of Jewish people by trying to convince them that they aren't safe, that they are surrounded by anti-Semites, and that they could only be safe by settling in occupied Palestine. Once they get there and swear loyalty to Zionism, they must, as settlers, actively participate in the oppression of Palestinians, for that is the cost of apartheid. And the American settlers who move to Israel don't really mind the cost and often ignore the suffering of the victims of Zionism because of the perks of apartheid. In recent months, it's been shown 95% of Israelis are pro-genocide. 45% want more. Many cheer when the IOF massacres Palestinians. Many are in support of rules of engagement that aim to kill any and all Palestinians. This is because many Israelis dehumanize Palestinians, seeing them as pigs for the slaughter, referring to starving Palestinians, who, mind you, are being starved by Israel, as ants. The Zionist education also serves to dehumanize Palestinians, as Nur Musalla uncovers right here. Palestinians, according to Israeli students, are not human. They are inhuman terrorists, murderers, bloodthirsty, backwards, lazy, and they do not deserve a right to life. And yet, even with an ongoing genocide, some liberal Zionists or Israeli sympathizers would dare clank down on their keyboards or take to the streets, screaming and shouting and saying, "Why don't they just talk? Why doesn't Hamas surrender and talk? Why don't the Palestinians just leave and go elsewhere? Just go elsewhere, you know?" Ghassan Kanafani answers all of these obnoxious questions in this interview.
The history of weak people fighting strong people. Of weak people who has a correct case fighting strong people who use their strength to exploit the weak.
Turn to the fighting that's been going on in Jordan in the recent weeks. It's your organization that's been one side of the fight. What has it achieved?
One thing, that we have a case to fight for. That's very much. These people, the Palestinian people, prefer to die standing than to lose its case. We achieved proving that the king is wrong. We achieved proving that this nation is going to continue fighting till victory. We achieved that our people could never be defeated. We achieved teaching every single person in this world that we are a small, brave nation who are going to fight to the last drop of blood to put justice for ourselves after the world failed in giving it to us. This is what we achieved.
It does seem that the war, the civil war, has been quite fruitless.
It's not a civil war. It's a people defending themselves against a fascist government, which you are defending because just King Hussein has an Arab passport. It's not a civil war.
Well, the conflict...
It's not a conflict. It's a liberation movement fighting for justice.
Well, whatever it might be best called...
It's not whatever, because this is where the problems start. Because this is what makes you answer all your questions, ask you all your questions. This is exactly where the problems start. This is a people who is discriminated, is fighting for his rights. This is a story. If you will say it's a civil war, then your questions will be justified. If you will say it's a conflict, then of course it's a surprise to know what's happening.
Why won't your organization engage in peace talks with the Israelis?
You don't mean exactly peace talks, you mean capitulation, surrendering.
Why not just talk?
Talk to whom?
Talk to the Israeli leaders.
That's kind of conversation between the sword and the neck, you mean?
Well, if there were no swords and no guns in the room, you could still talk.
No, I had never seen any talk between a colonialist case and a national liberation movement.
But despite this, why not talk?
Talk about what?
Talk about the possibility of not fighting.
Not fighting for what?
Not fighting at all, no matter what for.
Yeah, and people usually fight for something and they stop fighting for something. So you can't tell me even why should we speak about what?
Well, stop fighting.
Fight for what or talk about stop fighting why?
Talk to stop fighting, to stop the death and the misery, the destruction, the pain.
The misery and the destruction and the pain and the death of whom?
Of Palestinians, of Israelis, of Arabs.
Of the Palestinian people who are uprooted, thrown in the camps, living in starvation, killed for 20 years, and forbidden to use even the name Palestinians.
They're better that way than dead, though.
Maybe to you, but to us, it's not. To us, to liberate our country, to have dignity, to have respect, to have our mere human rights, is something as essential as life itself.
You call King
What angers
Hussein
me
a
is that I could speak and talk about anti-Zionism calmly, explaining to you what it is and what it instructs people to do. I can show you all of the evidence of Israel's war crimes from 1878 to 2024, and it may shake some of you. It may make some settlers in occupied Palestine really reflect, but it will have little to no impact on liberal Zionist settlers. Kenneth Annie understood this, and it's why the PFLP did not just engage in political intellectualism, but also found it necessary to have a military wing. To achieve liberation requires violence, because imagine being on the ground. Imagine being a victim of Zionism. The first generation watched the British legitimize Zionist colonization. The British then went on to bomb their villages and execute any who rose up and dared to challenge their first colonial occupiers. The next generation stood witness to the birth of Israel, which when it was born went house to house, killing all who moved. They bombed villages. They erased villages off the face of the earth and ethnically cleansed the lands, transferring Palestinians out. Just these two generations experienced a psychological warfare that hasn't been known to man since the Holocaust. The next generation grew up in camps, in ghettos, in wastelands, which were highly policed by Jordan and Israel. At this point you'd think, Khalas, it's over. Their will is broken. Palestinians will never return. The Iron Wall has won. It has extinguished hope. But it was in these camps where the PLO, the PFLP, and the DFLP rose, inspired by China, Vietnam, Algeria, and many other global south struggles for national liberation. Resistance gave Palestinians in those camps hope. It taught them about who political Zionists were. It taught them why their land was stolen, and it taught them the methods of liberation. So in the face of this oppression, this generation rose and fought. However, the Arab world had failed them, and despite being left alone to suffer, despite watching more and more of their land being stolen and placed under Israeli occupation, the resistance continued. The next generation grew up in a military-occupied police state. Many were kids when the occupation began. They watched their elders get massacred, men, women, and children, all fucking murdered. Yet, under this hellish occupation, the psychological warfare continued. The IOF were instructed by the Labour government to routinely go into Gaza and break the bones of men and kids. In this hell, Hamas, the vilified so-called terrorists, arose. Hamas has never called for a second Holocaust. Rather, it took inspiration from Algeria to liberate Palestine with Islam and the gun. The next generation watched the PLO surrender. They watched and stood witness to the Sabra and Shatila massacres. They watched the PLO become collaborators with their colonizers. So in that betrayal, in that anger, in the continued oppression, an intifada was called. It called on the Palestinians to unite and shake off their oppressors. The generation today lives under a sophisticated apartheid system that provides Israeli settlers heaven on earth, while it provides Palestinians hell. The people of Gaza did not start this war. No, this war began the second Zionist settlers arrived on Palestinian shores in 1878. In 2005, the Israeli government enforced an aerial, ground, and sea blockade on the concentration camp of Gaza. It was their humane, liberal method of starving out the people of Gaza. It was cruel, and the effects are being witnessed today. It's March 1st, 2024, and we add a new massacre to the list of hundreds of massacres. The Flower Massacre. The other day I saw a photo of a child who was crushed alive by an Israeli tank. Despite this bloody history of the victims of Zionism, Lawar and Israeli makes the note of silence. I can hear them. I can hear the screams and the cries of the victims of Zionism. I am deeply shaken. It enrages me. It makes me want to fight even more, to struggle even more with Palestinians. And yet, liberal Zionists are silent. They are unshaken. Oh, it's just a cost of security, they say. But don't you see, Lost? It's just what Israel does whenever it's threatened. How fucking heartless are you? The silence hurts. The lack of empathy is uncomprehendable. The lack of humanity has made me beyond furious. The lack of action makes me wonder how these people live in a settler colonial apartheid state. How do you sleep at night? Do you think about how secure you are under your blankets? Do you think about how once all the Palestinians are killed and wiped off the face of the earth or expelled from their land, you can finally have that heavenly peace and quiet? How do you sleep at night knowing you stand on Palestinian soil? You live and sleep in the houses of Palestinians, all while you bomb and snipe and kidnap and starve those who remain. You can't talk with your colonizers, because once you drop your gun and surrender, they will just massacre you. Decolonization is violent. In the presence of Palestinians, the indigenous peoples haunts Israeli settlers. With every rocket fired from Gaza, with every act of rebellion in the West Bank, Palestinians are saying, we're still here. You know that, right? We still exist despite your 100-year effort to erase us. And we will return to the land of Palestine. A Palestine that is free from oppression, colonization, dehumanization, and apartheid. To be an anti-Zionist is to hear the screams of Palestinians, to not only just listen to them, but acknowledge them as real victims of Zionism. It is to look at this long and bloody history and just feel something. You may feel sad, you may even cry, but soon the anger will emerge. Rage as hot as the words of Anah. A rage that says I will not normalize genocide of any kind. A rage that says I refuse to be complicit with genocide. It's a kind of rage that spurs people to take action and not just protest in the streets waving bags of flour, but to do something impactful. On the flip side, to be an anti-Zionist means to fight and struggle against anti-Semitism. It is to hold the position that anti-Semitism is curable, it is not eternal, and it's definitely not biological. Rather, to be an anti-Zionist means to stand beside Jewish people and fight with them against anti-Semitism. Unity and solidarity defeats anti-Semitism, not segregation, not colonization of other people's lands, and not committing a genocide of people who threaten your settler colony. To be an anti-Zionist in this regard means fighting against political Zionism's harms on the Jewish community, while also fighting for Palestinian liberation. For any Jewish person still watching, I want you to reflect on how Zionism has affected you. Reflect if it indoctrinated you, and if you still support political Zionism. If you still do, I want you to hear the screams of the victims of Zionism. I want you to learn about their names, their faces, to see them as human beings who have suffered. And I don't want you to simply talk or debate them, but to stand in solidarity with Palestinians in their struggle for liberation. To Israeli settlers still watching, hello! I want you to acknowledge that you're a settler, living and eating and sleeping on stolen land. I want you to stop covering your ears and eyes and listen to the screams of the victims, of your victims. And I know you can hear them suffer. So listen to them, acknowledge the harms of political Zionism, and see Palestinians as human beings who are deserving of human rights and a right to return. I know you've been indoctrinated. I know it's illegal to be an anti-Zionist, but other Israeli settlers have stood their ground, and I hope they give you courage to do something. I want you to reflect on what security really means, on what peace really means. I just want you to stop being silent and complicit in this genocide. Don't go marching in the streets holding and waving the Israeli flag, but burn it. You have the power to fight those blockading aid. You have the power to refuse to fight, not because you're afraid to die or you see it as a pointless war, but because of the suffering of Palestinians. The way I see it, liberal Zionists are all cowards, who are more than happy to watch a genocide, who are more than happy that their state oppresses Palestinians. But you can prove me wrong, and I hope you do. But I have little to no expectations. I have so little expectations because it's been 6 months of genocide, and I know you could hear the bombs. And yet you remain silent, unmoved, unshaken to do anything except for carry bags of flour. So my question to you, liberal Zionists, you fucking settlers, is how the fuck do you watch your state commit a genocide, starve people to death, and do absolutely nothing? Yet all you do is dare to ask, why do Palestinians resist? Why do they hate us? Why do they keep interrupting our peace? You might feel threatened by an angry Arab man who is boiling with rage by your inaction, and it's because you cannot nor will not hear the screams of your victims. They are screaming for liberation, for a world where for a single day they could live without you bombing and starving them, for a single day of true and actual peace. So yes, fuck Zionism and the iron walls you've built. The Palestinians and those who are standing in solidarity with them will shatter and demolish Jabotinsky's walls. We will send him to the depths of hell, where no one will ever be influenced by him and he'll be forgotten. The late and great Palestinian poet Rafah, a man who was assassinated by Israel, once wrote, "If I may die, let it bring hope." So in extension, I hope this video brings hope that political Zionism, like Nazism, will be dismantled, and in its deconstruction, a free Palestinian state will be built. I'm hopeful that day will come, because Palestine hasn't been lost. It isn't a lost future. This is the end. It's the end. Oh my god, it's the end. It's the end. I'm actually so happy. Hey guys. Hey, hi. Welcome to the end of the video. I want to personally thank you for watching this beast. I normally use these last few minutes to ramble about the future, but not this time. Before you leave, I want you to aid the people who are currently suffering in Gaza. Linked below are ways you can help out. There was a line in the first script that went something like this. Israelis and Western countries want you to believe that Palestinian life is cheap. I cut it from the video because it was too heavy, but I want you to think about the so-called cheapness of Palestinian life. I absolutely refuse to believe that Palestinian life is cheap, and nor should you. Second, yes, this video is monetized, but anything I make in this video, the Attack on Titan video, the last video, will all be sent to Gaza. And third, Dr. Falthman's video is out, and it's a total banger, so you should totally watch it. It's double the length of my video, so if you think this is long, no, it's not. It could have been longer. It could have been way longer, you know. I missed out on some Zionisms, you know, the post-Zionists, the neo-Zionists, the Christian Zionists. You know, we got we got more Zionisms out there. But yeah, you know, I cut them. You should thank me. You should absolutely thank me right now for cutting out Christian Zionism. Okay, it's time for some reflection. In my last video, I ended on this hopeful note. I told you not to fall into despair. This was before I saw the starvation, the flower massacres, and the El Shifa hospital massacre. There were many times when making this video where I lost hope. I spiraled into despair. I cried. A lot. How each and every war crime affected me shows in the final cut. But the rage was still there. The rage is always there. The idea of being silent was there. And so I fought that silence. I watched Edward Said, George Habash, Layla Khalid, and Ghassan Kanafani speak about resistance, and they gave me enough hope to finish this video and to keep on fighting, to keep on struggling with Palestinians. As corny as this sounds, when writing it felt like I was walking beside Kanafani, Saeed, and Fanah. They all held onto a dream of a free Palestine. They dedicated their lives to the cause. And it's a dream Palestinians currently carry. A dream that many of us now carry. It's a dream that will never die. Because it will come true. But as Frantz Fanon notes in his A Dying Colonialism, liberation is never just gifted to the colonized. It's won through the decolonization of one's mind, armed struggle, and revolution. Zionism's 100-year colonial mission in Palestine will die, and its grave will be a free Palestine. Hey, for the people who made it to the last 5 seconds, One Piece is next. So join me next time on my adventure to find the One Piece and become the Pirate King.